This is the Provoked Prawn, and this insane looking motherboard is the Asrock Z790 Livemixer, which I think is absolutely fantastic, quirky and weird and wonderful. Now, I bought this thing for a very affordable price. It's around $225 thereabouts, and it's so crazy that it even has a really funky looking BIOS. I've also mixed and matched this with some weird specs that I'll leave in the description, which might be a little bit illogical, but it's a Z790, which means it supports 12th, 13th, and 14th gen Intel CPUs. Now, this is a really affordable motherboard, but it's also one that packs in loads of features and yet is also missing some, which is kind of quirky. And that's the one reason I wanted to talk about it. So not only is it bonkers looking, but it also has some really nice highlights to it. Simple things like this really chunky heat shield for your NVMe SSD. Now, underneath there is actually a port for 2 NVMe SSDs, which you'll see if you look close up. But weirdly, they're so close together that you couldn't use your standard NVMe SSDs. You'd have to use smaller ones. So you can either use a 2280 NVMe SSD or a 2260, which is ever so slightly shorter. So you could combine them and then have that. But this motherboard has multiple ports for NVMe SSDs, which you'll see in the specs. And this is 2 of them, and I've never seen them so close together before because that's kind of quirky. Usually you have them more spread out so you could fit 2 standard NVMe SSDs side by side. But one of these ports, the one on the right-hand side, M2_1, is a Gen 5 port, which means that it will support something like this crucial T705 limited edition NVMe SSD, which offers up to 14,000 megabytes per second read speed, which is nuts. So this is already looking like an interesting board because you can fit a drive on there like this, which is fast and capable. And yet if you do that, you then block in the port on the other side and you won't be able to use it. This port is quirky as well because, as you see, there's no shielding below it. You do have that nice chunky heat shield above though, so if you're not using a drive like I am that already has one, you've got good cooling potential on it. But as you can see, you can get some pretty nifty speeds out of this, and I have tested it as well. And I'll do a separate video on this drive later on. Lower down though, you'll also spot there are other ports too. So you've also got Gen 4 NVMe ports. There's one down here which has no shielding in it at all, and yet that's a Hyper M2 port. And then below that is another couple hidden under this M2 armor. It's a weird choice not having armor and heat shielding on that one and then having it down here. But you can see there's some strange things going on here. But what you're seeing is multiple ports, multiple NVMe SSD ports on here. You've got at least 4 that you can easily access. So pretty simple there in terms of adding loads of storage in if you want to, and keeping it cool with the thermal pads and shielding as well, which I've shown in a separate video is pretty important. This board also supports DDR5 RAM, and that was another thing that not all the more affordable motherboards do. Now, this isn't a super budget motherboard, but I was surprised by just how many things are on offer there, and yet it's missing Wi-Fi. You'll see down here there's a port for installing your own Wi-Fi card, and this motherboard just plain doesn't have Wi-Fi standard. So for me, that's really strange to have so many different things in terms of Gen 5 NVMe SSD ports, and yet no Wi-Fi. You can see it's got a masses of USB ports on the back though, and you've got an Ethernet connection, so if you're not using Wi-Fi, you're not bothered about it, perfectly fine. 2 USB-C ports on the back there as well as USB-A's. So you've got loads of connectivity potential. Now there's some other things that I noticed as well during the build process, and the Montech case that I'm using, it's got a standard 3.0 USB-A plug on it, which naturally connects on the right hand side of the motherboard, pretty standard. But one of the other things that you might spy is that this motherboard also has 2 of those ports. So further down, side mounted down here is another one. Now, obviously this is ideal because it means you've got a choice in how you put your cable in, but also alternatively, if you happen to have a case like the Lian Li Evo XL, which you can see has 4 USB-A ports on the bottom of it, this motherboard would be perfect for that. And this is actually a rare thing. You don't often see that sort of connectivity on a motherboard for having 2 USB-A connections, especially on one so affordable. It also has multiple 5-volt RGB headers for connecting up fans and RGB things. So you can see on the right hand side and down the bottom here. We also have 2 USB internal connections, which is nice, and loads of chassis fan headers as well. You've got 12-volt RGB headers too, so there's multiple connectors on here for connecting loads of different things. It's got plenty of connectivity. You've also got chassis fan headers, CPU fan headers at the top, so there's plenty of access to plug in loads of fan cables. And I stuffed this inside the Montech King 95, as I said. Now, I actually purchased this on purpose because I thought it was a quirky looking motherboard. I wanted something that stood out. But what I didn't realise is that there's some other hidden joy here. So as well as looking really funky, you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's some RGB lighting, and that's not actually from the case, it's from the back of the motherboard. So on the rear of the motherboard is some little LEDs just along the side here, which then give you some more RGB lighting glow from your case and from the build. So this isn't actually part of the case. That's the motherboard that's shining that onto the back of the case there. That's a nice little quirk, I think. It's kind of hidden in some ways, depending on how you mount your GPU. You can see it's still visible here from the 4070, and whether you like it or not, or depending on the angle you're sitting at, you might not see it, or maybe it doesn't matter. But it will obviously sync with the RGB because there are some tools that you can use. So Asrock has got some software and you can control it from the BIOS, which I'll show you in a second. But if you're vertically mounting your graphics card, as I've done here, you then just can't see it, so it kind of defeats the object of that, which is quirky. Now, there are some downsides. It's worth saying, obviously, it's missing the Wi-Fi. The other thing is that if you populate that top slot, so the Gen 5 slot, that will halve the number of PCIe lanes available to your graphics card. So it drops that graphics card slot, the top slot, from PCIe Gen 5 to Gen 4, and then halves the number of lanes, so it goes to 8 lanes instead of 16. However, as I've shown before, that doesn't really matter. It shouldn't have a negative impact on gaming performance, and I'll link to that video that I've done in the past in the description. But the Gen 5 slot at the top, as you can see, is working as expected. It's showing that it's Gen 5. It's X4 speeds, and as I've shown already, it is actually going to the right amount of speed, so it does read really quickly. And considering the processor that I've got in the system and just the general sort of setup of the system, it is impressive. But you do have some sort of negative impact depending on your setup here, so something to bear in mind. But as I've shown, performance doesn't take much of a hit. BIOS itself is also not only really funky looking, but pretty easy to use. There are a few different things in here. Obviously, you can turn XMP on to improve your RAM speeds, and there was a couple of profiles in there. I found that was easy to switch to, seemed to be stable as well. So I put it on DDR5 6000 mega transfers, and then it just worked just fine. There's a fan cooling facility. We can go in and customize that. You can also adjust it, so you can set it to say what size cooler you've got for your CPU as well. And then you can go in and tweak a lot of other settings in there. So there's plenty of other things that you can customize as well. One of which you'll see is the Asrock Polychrome RGB. So from the BIOS, you can control the RGB lighting. Now this is from the 5-volt headers, and then obviously the LEDs on there as well. So if you've got things connected, as I have in this case, the Montech fans, for example, directly connected to there, you can choose from a variety of different styles, customize it directly in the BIOS. That's not something I've seen very often. Usually you'd need to download software in Windows in order to adjust this, but if you want to, you can just hop straight into the BIOS and tweak this, which means you don't need to put any bloatware on your system potentially. Alternatively, you can download it in Windows as well, and then you can customize in there and obviously get it to match and choose which headers is changing as well. So there's plenty of tweaks that you can do to that. So all told, I actually was really surprised by this motherboard in a number of ways, and it matches up with the system that I built pretty nicely. If you're interested, come back soon to see a full video on the Montech case. And thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to check out links in the description to find out more. Thanks very much for watching. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and give me a thumbs up because that really helps. Drop a comment down below if you've got any questions, and watch these other videos. And most importantly, have a great life.